In the pale light of dawn, the Himalayan peaks rose like silent sentinels, their summits lost in drifting mist. Far below, a solitary royal palace emerged from the fog, its towers shadowed yet imposing, as if guarding secrets that time itself had forgotten. For centuries, these walls had witnessed ceremonies, celebrations, and whispered conversations that shaped the fate of a nation. On this morning, however, there was an unusual stillness, a calm that hinted at the storm yet to arrive. The streets of the surrounding valley were quiet, the scent of pine mingling with the crisp mountain air, but inside the palace, invisible currents of tension moved like hidden rivers beneath marble floors. Every corner held history, every corridor carried expectation, and every figure within was caught in the delicate balance of duty and desire. No one outside could foresee how one night within these walls would shatter centuries of tradition, leaving a mark on the country that would never fade. The gates of the palace stood closed, heavy and unyielding, as sunlight brushed across cobblestone paths and carved long shadows. Guards in ceremonial attire patrolled silently, their eyes scanning the horizon, unaware of the tragedy that would soon unfold within these very walls. Inside, the corridors were pristine, polished by generations of attendants who moved like ghosts, tending to the rhythms of royal life. The family, accustomed to protocol and hierarchy, prepared for another evening of gatherings that would appear ordinary to anyone observing from afar. Yet beneath the surface, subtle tensions festered, ambitions, desires, and hidden conflicts weaving themselves into a fragile tapestry of palace life. This balance, maintained for decades, had become delicate, almost brittle. One misplaced word, one overlooked glance, could ripple through the intricate web of relationships. On this morning, the palace seemed calm, but the calm was deceptive. The history of power, loyalty, and secrecy had prepared the stage for a moment when all appearances would shatter, and the walls that had protected generations would witness horror beyond comprehension. The crown prince walked alone through the palace gardens, his military uniform crisp, his steps measured but heavy with the weight of expectation. Mist curled around ancient trees, hiding paths and shadows alike, mirroring the uncertainty that clung to him. He carried with him the dual burden of tradition and desire, the knowledge that every decision, every emotion, every thought would be scrutinized by the palace, the public, and history itself. Those who observed him from a distance could see only discipline and duty, yet beneath the surface, emotions churned like the fog that surrounded him. Ambitions collided with familial loyalty. Personal desires clashed with national responsibility. He was caught in a prison of gold and marble, trapped by the very lineage that had promised honor and influence. In this quiet moment, the gardens felt like a refuge, a world removed from scrutiny, yet fate had already begun to move. Each step, each breath, carried him closer to an inevitable night that would unravel not just his life, but the lives of those he loved most. The billiard room lay empty, polished wood gleaming under sunlight streaming through tall windows. To an outsider, it seemed a room of simple elegance, a place for leisure and family conversation. Yet within these walls, history had repeated itself countless times, celebrations, strategic discussions, and private family moments woven together in quiet rituals. On this particular day, the room was poised for a gathering that would appear ordinary, yet beneath the calm, tensions swirled. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every angle of light bore witness to centuries of privilege and secrecy. The very air seemed to hum with unspoken rules, where to stand, how to speak, and whom to honor. These invisible codes, invisible to the outside world, controlled lives, desires, and interactions with the precision of clockwork. But like a glass under pressure, even the most carefully maintained structure can shatter. And that night, the room would bear witness to an explosion of grief, fear, and chaos that no palace could absorb. It was serene now, but serenity can be the most dangerous mask of all. The royal family moved toward the billiard room with measured elegance, their faces composed but revealing subtle hints of unease. Protocol dictated every gesture, bows, nods, polite smiles. Yet beneath this layer of composure, emotions churned quietly. The heir apparent carried a tension that could not be articulated, the queen's calm resolve barely masked concern, siblings exchanged glances loaded with unspoken words. For anyone observing, this was merely a formal family gathering. But inside the palace, every step was a negotiation between duty and desire, loyalty and personal struggle. In these small moments, the threads of history tightened around them like a net, drawing them closer to an event that no ritual, no preparation, could avert. The world outside the gates remained unaware, moving in its own rhythms, while the corridors ahead would soon echo with chaos. This procession of tradition, so ordinary in appearance, concealed the first tremors of a night that would change everything. The crown prince paused midway down a long hallway, resting his hand on the railing, eyes distant and shadowed. Sunlight spilled behind him, illuminating the fine dust in the air, yet his mind was elsewhere, far from the palace's expectations and decorum. He carried questions no one could answer, about loyalty, about love, about the balance between desire and duty. Inside, corridors whispered secrets of generations; outside, the world awaited him, oblivious. Each heartbeat echoed like a warning in the silence, though no one could hear it. History, in this suspended moment, seemed to slow, offering him a fleeting chance to step back from inevitability. Yet destiny, as it often does, had already begun its quiet work, setting the pieces in motion for a night that would leave grief, speculation, and unanswered questions for decades. His pause was more than hesitation, it was the calm before the storm, the stillness before chaos claimed its course. The palace guard stood at attention, rigid, disciplined, and alert, yet an undercurrent of tension rippled through them. They were trained for every scenario: intrusion, unrest, rebellion, but nothing in their manuals could prepare them for what was about to unfold from within. Each glance down the hallways was sharp, professional, yet instinctive unease tugged at their senses. Protocol dictated caution, but caution can be paralyzing when the threat comes from the most unlikely place, one of their own. The weight of centuries of tradition bore down on them, and though they were prepared to defend the palace against the world, no one was prepared for the storm born of personal conflict and inner turmoil. Their presence, so commanding and authoritative, would soon be tested not by an enemy outside, but by the invisible pressures and fractures within the royal family. And as the minutes passed, the stage for tragedy silently took shape, unnoticed and unstoppable. The ornate doors of the palace, intricately carved and gleaming with centuries of polish, were slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling onto the corridor floor. To anyone outside, it would seem harmless, perhaps a servant had left them open, or a draft had moved them. But inside, every shadow and every crack of light seemed to hold a secret, a tension that only those who had walked these halls daily could feel. The palace was alive with whispers of anticipation, though no one could yet identify the source. The corridors, usually orderly, felt heavier, charged with unspoken emotion. The stillness was a mask, fragile and deceptive, waiting for the moment when it would shatter. It is often in these small, quiet details that history pivots: a door left slightly ajar, a pause in routine, a glance that lingers too long. That evening, these subtle fractures were the first signs that the palace, with all its grandeur and discipline, was about to witness an event that would mark generations forever. Around the billiard table, the royal family gathered, their postures immaculate, their expressions carefully measured. The chandelier cast a warm glow over the polished surface, reflecting both elegance and the weight of expectation. Conversation was polite, formal, yet beneath it, a subtle tension hummed in the air like an electric current. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word weighed, each movement carrying significance far beyond the immediate moment. To an outsider, this might appear as nothing more than a refined gathering, a ceremonial ritual of unity. But inside, hidden beneath etiquette and tradition, unspoken conflict simmered, desires restrained, ambitions suppressed, loyalties questioned. This room, meant for leisure and connection, became a crucible of emotion. In the quietest corners of their minds, each family member sensed something shifting, a storm gathering. And as they leaned over the billiard table, unaware, they were inching closer to a night that would redefine the course of the monarchy and carve an indelible scar across the history of Nepal. The crown prince exited the room for a brief moment, leaving the space echoing with quiet absence. The palace corridor stretched empty ahead, shafts of sunlight streaming through tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing lazily in the still air. His steps, deliberate yet heavy with unspoken thoughts, seemed to reverberate against the marble, marking the passage of someone burdened with invisible weight. Even in solitude, he was observed, not by eyes, but by the history embedded in every wall, the silent expectations of generations watching him without judgment. The palace, in its grandeur, had been designed to guide, constrain, and define the movements of those who lived within. Yet, on this morning, the very halls seemed complicit in the tension building inside him. He paused momentarily, as if to weigh what lay ahead, before returning. That pause, brief as it was, became one of the pivotal hinges upon which fate would turn. Each step forward now carried consequences that no protocol, no tradition, could undo. The polished marble floor of the palace, once pristine, now bore scattered brass bullet casings, glinting faintly as sunlight caught their edges. Each shell told a fragment of a story, a testament to moments of chaos that had ripped through centuries of disciplined order. The quiet corridors of the palace, usually echoing only with ceremonial footsteps, now held an unbearable silence, heavy with loss. Investigators would later describe the scene as surreal, a collision of opulence and violence, where chandeliers and gold-leafed walls met the stark, cold reality of human tragedy. Each casing was more than metal, it was evidence, a clue that someone's emotions, decisions, and desperation had crystallized into action. The floor, once a stage for protocol, now reflected the fragility of life, the vulnerability hidden behind prestige and power. For historians, forensic analysts, and the nation alike, these scattered shells would become a haunting reminder: no tradition, no wealth, no lineage, could shield anyone from the forces of anger, grief, and despair that had erupted within the palace walls that night. The queen sat in her ornate chair, her posture poised but her expression frozen in shock. Around her, the palace descended into chaos, a stark contrast to the serene elegance it had always projected. The careful balance of hierarchy, tradition, and ceremony had been violently disrupted, leaving those present disoriented and fearful. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, reflected not only concern for her family but a profound awareness of history unraveling in real time. Within the opulent walls, centuries of stability had collapsed in minutes, replaced by confusion, grief, and the unrelenting presence of death. Even those trained for protocol struggled to act, paralyzed by the speed and intensity of events. In that moment, the queen became both witness and symbol, the embodiment of a lineage under siege, a representation of a nation teetering between shock and comprehension. Her stillness amidst the storm was as powerful as the chaos around her, highlighting the human fragility behind ceremonial power, and the painful truth that no rank, no protocol, could contain the collapse of trust, love, and family. Prince Narayan lay on the marble floor, the flickering light of a nearby candle casting long shadows across his motionless form. Guards rushed past, unsure whether to intervene or wait for protocol to dictate their actions, every second stretching into an eternity. In this violent, suspended moment, the palace's centuries of discipline collided with raw human terror. The elegance of the chandeliers and gold-trimmed walls now felt incongruous, almost cruel, as blood and fear permeated the space. Observers would later recount the surreal nature of the scene, the contrast between the polished grandeur and the chaos unfolding, where life and death hung in the balance, dictated by a chain of events few could fully comprehend. For Narayan, there was no time for thought, only the finality of a fate no one anticipated. His presence, once a symbol of youth, hope, and continuity, now underscored the fragility of even the most privileged lives. And as the guards tried to respond, the palace became a stage of tragedy that would leave a permanent imprint on both history and memory. In the cool mist of the palace garden, the crown prince was discovered, gravely injured, half hidden among shadows of towering walls and ancient trees. His fall, whether deliberate or desperate, was the pivot upon which the night's tragedy turned. The gardens, usually a sanctuary of reflection and beauty, now held the weight of irreversible loss. The air smelled of damp earth, mingled with the metallic tang of fear and blood. Staff and attendants circled him, unsure how to reconcile their loyalty to him with the horrors that had unfolded within the palace. Every movement, every sigh, every muted cry reflected the confusion that gripped those present. Observers later described a chilling stillness around him, a silence that contrasted the chaos inside the palace. Here was the heir apparent, the future of a nation, caught between life and death, symbolizing both continuity and collapse. In that misty garden, the monarchy's fate hung in balance, as fragile and elusive as the shadows stretching across the palace walls. The military hospital became a crucible of urgency that night, doctors and nurses moving swiftly through hallways, stretchers and equipment in a precise ballet of emergency care. Each step, each decision, carried unimaginable weight. The lives of a nation's most prominent figures rested on human hands, skill, and instinct. The corridors, sterile and bright, were filled with tension and the low hum of machines, punctuated by hurried instructions and the distant sound of approaching ambulances. Every wounded royal was treated with meticulous care, yet the scale of injury stretched the staff's expertise and endurance. Outside the hospital walls, the nation awaited news, rumors circulating in every corner of Kathmandu, fueled by fear and uncertainty. Inside, life and death battled silently, doctors confronting the impossible, balancing hope against the cruel inevitability of mortality. In these sterile halls, the human cost of ambition, desire, and familial conflict became palpable, a stark reminder that even the most exalted lives are bound by fragility, and that history is often written not only by actions, but by the consequences of a single, devastating night. The streets of Kathmandu filled with a sea of mourners, their faces etched with grief, disbelief, and confusion. Flags flew at half-mast, and the air was thick with solemnity, incense, and the quiet hum of collective mourning. The funeral procession moved slowly, carrying the bodies of those whose lives had been violently cut short, each step echoing the weight of history lost. Ordinary citizens and officials alike lined the streets, eyes fixed on the ornate carriages, hands clasped, heads bowed. For many, it was not just a funeral, it was a reckoning. Centuries of tradition, duty, and monarchy had been suddenly shattered, leaving the nation suspended between memory and trauma. The streets bore witness to more than grief, they bore witness to a collective questioning of authority, the fragility of trust, and the fragility of life itself. With each slow, measured step of the procession, Kathmandu seemed to absorb the tragedy, internalizing the loss and silently acknowledging that life, even in grandeur, could be irrevocably fragile. Forensic teams arrived at the billiard room, methodical and precise, transforming the space from a hall of leisure into a meticulous investigation site. They measured bullet trajectories, collected shell casings, and photographed every detail, seeking to reconstruct a night that seemed impossible to fully understand. Dust, blood, and shattered furniture told stories the eye could barely grasp, while evidence was pieced together like fragments of a shattered mirror. Every mark on the marble floor, every displacement of objects, hinted at actions, choices, and desperate movements that defined the night. The investigators worked with urgency, knowing that the fate of history, law, and public trust rested on their conclusions. Yet even as they documented every angle, questions remained. Why had security hesitated? Could a tragedy of this magnitude have been prevented? The billiard room, once a symbol of unity and refinement, had become a silent witness to betrayal, despair, and the ultimate fragility of human control, its polished walls holding secrets that even the sharpest eyes struggled to read. Outside the palace gates, crowds had gathered, a mix of journalists, citizens, and officials, each seeking answers from a place that had become synonymous with tragedy. Microphones recorded every statement, cameras captured every moment, yet even the most exhaustive reporting could not penetrate the full truth. Rumors and speculation circulated, some plausible, some impossible, all reflecting the nation's need to comprehend the incomprehensible. Voices rose, questions hung in the air, but the walls of the palace offered no clarity. The weight of centuries of secrecy pressed down upon everyone outside. Citizens hoped for accountability, for an explanation that could restore trust, while journalists pursued fragments, piecing together timelines, statements, and inconsistencies. In the shadows of this grand palace, reality collided with perception. The public, grieving yet determined, became a living chorus demanding that history not be silenced. Outside these gates, the tragedy was no longer private, it had become a national event, an enduring enigma that would provoke debate, sorrow, and reflection for generations. In a quiet, secured room, forensic evidence was methodically laid out: weapons, bullet shells, scattered documents. Each item was more than an object, it was a key to understanding the night that had consumed the royal family. Investigators traced fingerprints, examined powder residue, and reconstructed sequences of events with painstaking care. The meticulous display of evidence, however, was more than technical, it was symbolic. Every shell, every weapon, every paper carried a story of decisions, despair, and inevitability. Analysts worked in silence, aware that their conclusions would shape public perception and history itself. Questions of motive, intention, and responsibility hovered over the scene. Was this the result of a single hand guided by inner turmoil, or were there deeper forces at play? The items on the table represented both clarity and ambiguity. They offered pieces of truth but could not convey the emotional complexity, the subtle pressures, or the fractured loyalties that had led to an unthinkable night. Even in evidence, some shadows refused to be illuminated. In the courtroom, sketches captured officials and surviving family members in formal attire, their faces a mixture of grief, apprehension, and resolve. Proceedings unfolded slowly, as lawyers, judges, and witnesses sought to untangle the complex web of events from that fateful night. Each statement, each examination, became a thread in the tapestry of history, seeking to explain tragedy, motive, and responsibility. Outside the courtroom, citizens followed closely, their trust hanging on procedural transparency and the pursuit of justice. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, every gesture and expression seemed to speak volumes. Some witnesses struggled to recall details accurately, while others revealed insights that clarified parts of the timeline. The court, as an institution, became a stage where personal grief intersected with national inquiry. Here, the abstract concepts of accountability, law, and historical record met the raw reality of loss, as the nation demanded answers from a tragedy whose resonance would never fade. As night fell, the palace gardens assumed an eerie stillness, lit only by faint lamps that cast long shadows over manicured hedges and stone pathways. The air, thick with mist, seemed almost alive, holding echoes of whispers, hurried footsteps, and memories of the day's chaos. Each lamp created pockets of illumination, but darkness dominated, reminding all who entered that history often hides its most troubling secrets in shadow. The gardens, once a refuge of calm and contemplation, now carried the weight of grief and reflection. Investigators and palace staff moved cautiously, retracing paths, reconstructing moments, and searching for overlooked details. The quiet amplified every sound, every movement, and every heartbeat, as if the gardens themselves were observing, judging, and preserving the memory of what had transpired. Night, in this place of beauty and power, had become a mirror of the nation's mood, somber, reflective, and haunted by loss. The palace archives held centuries of history, dusty documents, faded photographs, and meticulous records that chronicled generations of rulers, decisions, and ceremonial events. As investigators pored over these materials, they sought context, precedent, and insight into the pressures that had shaped the royal family's dynamics. Each photograph told a story of celebration, duty, and unity, now juxtaposed painfully against the recent tragedy. Letters and journals revealed patterns of expectation, loyalty, and sometimes unspoken tension. The archives were a silent witness, preserving the continuity of history even as the present was shattered. Researchers understood that while these artifacts could not explain every nuance of that fateful night, they offered crucial pieces to interpret motives, pressures, and interpersonal relationships. In their quiet, dust-laden presence, the past conversed with the present, allowing the nation to glimpse how centuries of tradition, honor, and secrecy had converged to create both grandeur and vulnerability. Police and military officials gathered around maps and diagrams, plotting response strategies and reconstructing timelines. Every mark, line, and notation represented both a procedural necessity and the weight of national accountability. They debated the flow of events, security lapses, and potential alternatives, aware that the nation's trust rested on their clarity and objectivity. Each officer brought experience and instinct to the table, yet the enormity of the tragedy rendered even the most seasoned cautious. The meeting was a delicate balance between analysis and respect, as officials worked to separate fact from rumor, evidence from speculation. Here, the machinery of order confronted the chaos of human decisions. In this room, history was being examined not just for documentation, but for understanding, a painstaking effort to reconstruct not only what had happened, but why, and how future failures could be prevented. The weight of responsibility was tangible, pressing on every shoulder, and reflected in every serious glance around the table. Across the nation, television screens flickered with the images and reports of a tragedy that seemed almost surreal. Anchors spoke with measured tones, their expressions solemn, conveying the gravity of the events unfolding inside the palace walls. Viewers watched in silence, absorbing fragments of information, rumors, and official statements. Families huddled together, citizens whispered, and a collective shock gripped every urban center and village. The broadcasts became a conduit between private loss and public consciousness, translating incomprehensible violence into narratives that the nation could engage with. Each report balanced fact and speculation, striving to maintain credibility while acknowledging the enormity of grief. For many, this was the first step toward processing what had occurred, a bridge between the private horrors of the palace and the public reckoning that would follow. And as the broadcasts continued, they reminded viewers that history was not static, it was lived, felt, and continuously interpreted. In the forensic lab, analysts worked under bright lights, examining bullet trajectories, powder residue, and ballistic evidence. Every angle, every measurement was critical in piecing together the sequence of events from that night. The room smelled faintly of chemicals and metal, a sharp contrast to the solemnity outside. As evidence was examined, theories formed and were tested, each adjustment altering the perceived timeline of tragedy. Investigators documented every detail, from the smallest casings to the largest marks on the walls, aware that these findings would shape not only the official narrative but the collective understanding of the event. The precision of their work contrasted with the chaos of the night, illustrating how human skill attempts to reconcile grief, confusion, and mortality. Here, amidst microscopes and charts, science met history, striving to illuminate a path toward clarity, accountability, and closure. Protests erupted in city streets, citizens demanding transparency, accountability, and justice. Banners waved, voices rose in unison, and the air vibrated with the energy of a nation unwilling to remain silent. Ordinary people became the custodians of moral authority, insisting that history be documented truthfully, that grief be acknowledged, and that power be held accountable. These demonstrations reflected not only anger but resilience, a refusal to allow tragedy to be buried under ceremony or silence. Police maintained order, but the spirit of the people could not be contained. Each chant, each raised fist, was a statement that society would confront uncomfortable truths. The massacre, once confined to palace walls, now reverberated across Kathmandu and beyond, reminding leaders that authority is fragile when trust is lost, and that the collective conscience of a nation is both powerful and enduring. In the courtroom, Crown Prince's medical reports and evidence boards were central to discussions, illustrating a timeline that was as tragic as it was complex. Lawyers presented findings, debating the interpretations of forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and medical conclusions. The room was tense, heavy with the gravity of its purpose. Each report, each board, carried the weight of history, offering explanations yet leaving gaps for speculation. Observers felt the duality of procedure and emotion, the meticulous pursuit of truth alongside the raw, human sorrow of loss. Here, the machinery of justice attempted to wrest meaning from chaos, to reconcile responsibility with circumstance, and to provide the public with a narrative that could bridge grief and understanding. Even as proceedings advanced, questions remained, but the courtroom became a symbol that the nation's pursuit of truth, however imperfect, would continue, and that the events of that night would be scrutinized for generations. Years later, the Narayanhiti Palace was transformed into a museum, opening its gates to the public and allowing history to breathe beyond secrecy. Once a private residence, the palace now stood as a reminder of glory, tragedy, and the fragility of power. Evening sunlight bathed its walls in gold, casting long shadows that spoke of events both celebrated and mourned. Visitors walked through halls once reserved for royalty, pausing at portraits, artifacts, and rooms where history had unfolded with intensity and consequence. The transition from private grandeur to public reflection symbolized a nation's attempt to reconcile with its past. Each exhibit preserved memory, while inviting inquiry, contemplation, and learning. The palace was no longer just a symbol of authority, it had become a space for collective memory, education, and reflection, reminding all who entered that even in loss, history endures, and truth, however complex, remains a shared responsibility. Young visitors gazed at the museum exhibits with curiosity and awe, absorbing lessons of a history that was at once beautiful and tragic. Candlelight flickered on their faces, illuminating both innocence and reflection. Through portraits, artifacts, and preserved rooms, they encountered stories of power, loyalty, ambition, and human frailty. For these children, history was no longer abstract, it was tangible, a living lesson that decisions, conflicts, and emotions carry consequences across generations. They whispered among themselves, asking questions, piecing together fragments of a past they could neither experience nor fully comprehend. In their curiosity, hope emerged, hope that understanding the past would guide future actions, and that empathy, vigilance, and reflection could prevent repetition of tragedy. The museum, through their eyes, became a bridge, connecting memory to insight, sorrow to learning, and history to the promise of a more conscious and resilient generation. As the sun set over the Himalayan peaks, casting golden light across the Narayanhiti Palace, a sense of calm and reflection settled over the land. Shadows stretched long across the gardens and corridors that had once witnessed unimaginable tragedy. The palace now stood not as a symbol of authority, but as a testament to resilience, memory, and the endurance of a nation. History, with all its complexities, had been preserved, its lessons waiting for those willing to look, learn, and reflect. The mountains, timeless and serene, watched silently, a reminder that life continues even after loss, that societies endure, and that truth, though often obscured, ultimately shapes collective destiny. From tragedy emerged understanding, and from reflection emerged growth. The nation, scarred yet steadfast, moved forward, carrying the memories of a night that ended more than a dynasty, leaving behind a story of grief, consequence, and the human capacity to endure, rebuild, and honor both past and future.